If you stop and think about it, it's actually quite amazing that there have now been not one, but two federal court cases holding exactly the same thing, that the Biden administration engaged in one of the most serious, one of the gravest direct frontal attacks on the free speech guarantee of the First Amendment by continuously not just pressuring or coercing, but threatening big tech companies that they must censor a wide variety of political speech that are disliked by various agencies in the Biden administration, including the FBI, the CDC, and others, including the Biden White House. Or else, the Biden administration said, for failure to censor that content, these companies will suffer all sorts of legal and retaliatory reprisals. Obviously, the executive branch has enormous control over big tech and punish them in all sorts of ways. And with regarding numerous crises, there's been all sorts of censorship that nominally was implemented by big tech, but in fact was pressured and cajoled and directed by the Biden administration. And there's all kinds of case law we've covered before, which holds that the federal government cannot indirectly censor what they would be barred constitutionally from censoring, meaning they can't threaten private actors to censor for them. And yet that's exactly what the Biden administration has done. And the court was clear, first the district court and then the three-judge appellate court, that this is not some small or technical violation of the First Amendment. According to the court, this is one of the gravest violations, arguably in the history of the judiciary, to take the internet and try and systematically censor it in this manner. And yet, there's been almost no media coverage of this. The people who claim to be the safeguards and the guardians of American democracy, who have been found to have been supporting this, have said almost nothing. Media outlets have barely covered this at all. And so just this week, the independent journalists Matt Taibbi and Michael Shellenberger, who have done great work in exposing a lot of the censorship regime, including the Twitter files, published a new joint article, investigative article, that is also bylined by Alex Gutentag at the joint Substack that they have to publish these articles. And there you see the article on the screen. It's from the CTIL files #1. They have a whistleblower. And the title is US and UK military contractors created a sweeping plan for global censorship in 2018, new documents show. A whistleblower makes troves of new documents available to public and racket, showing the birth of the censorship industrial complex in reaction to Brexit and Trump election in 2016. Now, this is the key point. The history of censorship is exactly this. This type of censorship really did not exist prior to 2016. It's all new. Of course, there was some big tech censorship here and there, but for the most part, the entire system and the vast bulk of what we're discussing, people being banned off the internet for their political speech, really emerged in the wake of 2016. And that's because the Western establishment suffered two severe blows in 2016. First, when subjects of the United Kingdom, a majority of them, voted to leave the EU by approving the Brexit referendum. And then just a few short months later, when they delivered the real traumatic blow, which was rejecting Hillary Clinton and electing Donald Trump to the Oval Office. And in the wake of those two events, Western elites, especially American elites, decided that the internet can no longer be free, that once the internet is free, people are free to make up their own minds and no longer under the control of Western elites. And that's when they began to implement this systemic censorship regime as a way of getting people under control, to control the flow of information that they can receive, which in turn allows them to control behavior. That is why I spend so much time on this issue, why it's such a central cause of mine. If you can dictate what populations can and can't hear, that is a level of control and authoritarianism that makes elections irrelevant. Because if people are going and voting for who they're told to vote for because they've only been allowed to hear the information that power centers want them to hear, which is what the system is designed to do, the elections are basically illusory. That's why the First Amendment of the Constitution guaranteed free speech. It really, in so many ways, is one of the rights on which all the others depend. And here's what they write, quote, "A whistleblower has come forward with an explosive new trove of documents, rivaling or exceeding the Twitter files and Facebook files in scale and importance. They described the activities of a, quote, anti-disinformation group called the Cyber Threat Intelligence League, or CTIL, that officially began as the volunteer project of data scientists and defense and intelligence veterans, but whose tactics over time appear to have been absorbed into multiple official projects, including those of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, remember, the whole emergence of the disinformation industry, the people who are disinformation experts who decree what is disinformation and what is not, to allow big tech to censor, to allow governments to justify or demand that censorship, quickly emerged overnight. There is no expertise called a disinformation expert. That is a concocted and made up field of discipline. And it emerged in order to justify the censorship regime, to make it seem like it was the byproduct of data analysis, rather than what it is, which is suppression of political speech based on ideology. Quote, lock your shit down, explains one document about creating, quote, your spy disguise. Another explains that while such activities overseas are, quote, typically done by the CIA and NSA and the Department of Defense, censorship efforts against Americans have to be done using private partners because the government doesn't have the, quote, legal authority. The whistleblower alleges that a leader of the CTI League, a former British intelligence analyst, was, quote, in the room at the Obama White House in 2017 when she received the instructions to create a counter-disinformation project to stop a repeat of 2016. Now a larger trove of new documents, including strategy documents, training videos, presentations, and internal messages, reveal that in 2019, US and UK military and intelligence contractors led by a former UK defense researcher named Sarah Jane S.J. Terp developed this sweeping censorship framework. Those contractors co-led CTIL, which partnered with CISA in the spring of 2020, that is, the department inside the Department of Homeland Security. CTIL's ultimate goal, said the whistleblower, quote, was to become part of the federal government. In our weekly meetings, they made it clear they were building these organizations within the federal government, and if you built the first iteration, we could secure a job for you. Terp's plan, which she shared in presentations to information security and cybersecurity groups in 2019, was to create, quote, misinfosec communities that would include government. This is the creation of the disinformation industry right before your eyes, which in turn is intended to provide a justification, a cover, a pretext for how big tech censors political speech at the dictates of the government, not by claiming that it is suppressing ideological dissent, but instead disinformation. Who wants false claims being circulated? The problem, of course, is that the people who are in control of determining what is true and false are the government officials themselves. That's in whose hands this censorship regime resides. Now, here is a video of Congressman Dan Bishop, who's a Republican on the committee, and we're going to include this because he provides such an impassioned and clear and articulate summary of what has happened with these judicial findings about the Biden administration directly violating free speech in a systematic way. And the witness who's on this panel with Shellenberger and Taibbi is named Olivia Troy. She's a former advisor to former Vice President Mike Pence, who has decided to rebrand as an anti-Trump conservative. She goes around talking about how dangerous Donald Trump is. And so they had her there, the Democrats did. The Democrats often ignore Taibbi and Shellenberger, didn't want to hear about this censorship regime, of course. To have Olivia Troy, Vice President Pence's former aide, talk about the evils of Trump. But in doing so, they roped her in into defending the censorship regime. So listen to Congressman Bishop.
You're aware that the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has reviewed that, found that the findings of the district court were well supported by evidence, and modified and substantially affirmed the preliminary injunction against the government entered by. Are you aware of all that? And does it affect your view that all of this is a figment of imagination?
I am aware of the decision. I also want to clarify, I have not actually never said that this is a conspiracy. You've not heard that comment from me.
So you believe there is censorship going on by means of the federal government on social media platforms, or has been?
I can only speak to my experience, and I will say that I've sat in a lot of these interagency meetings with social media companies, and ultimately it was their decision.
Okay, so That already is an incredible omission if you think about it. She, as Vice President Pence's representative in these intra-agency meetings with the national security state, was frequently sitting in on meetings where the US government would meet with big tech and would instruct big tech on what content they wanted censored. This wasn't the Trump administration or Biden political actors in this case doing it. It was the CIA and the FBI and the CDC trying to remove content that they disliked. And in order to defend this, because she's there as a Democratic Party witness, she tries to say, ultimately it was the tech companies that pushed the delete button or the censor button. But of course, the courts found that they did so at the direction of the federal government.
And ultimately, it was their decision. And I will say that when content was removed, it was ultimately up to them. We followed.
Yeah, but see, that's what the court has said is the problem, is that the agencies have engaged in this subterfuge where they say, well, we want you to make the decision, but they're all over them to the point that their constant involvement makes it government involvement. That's the threat. Mr. Shellenberger, let me turn to you. Because I was thinking about where we are. Twitter files revealed these connections, right? Direct connections between Elvis Chan, the FBI, and social media companies, CISA and the social media companies. And then your further reporting, and yours, Mr. Taibbi, revealed the next layer, which is what you call the censorship industrial complex. The connection between CISA funding these adjacent agencies, Stanford, people at Stanford, people at the University of Washington, and so they could offload this exact subterfuge, and they could pre-bunk stuff and stop whole narratives from taking hold. And now your CTI League shows yet another dynamic in two ways, it seems. You've got this guy, we ought to get his name out there for folks, Pablo Brewer, you said, a commander with the Special Operations Command, I believe, at somewhere, and he's involved in this CTI League, but they got Israeli, you mentioned British intelligence, and you say this in part of your report, the authors, and talking about one of their reports, advocated for police, military, and intelligence involvement in censorship across Five Eyes nations, and even suggested that Interpol should be involved. Why is that significant, Mr. Schellenberger?
Because
it's not blindingly obvious. And do it as quickly as you can, because I've got one other thing I really want to get to if we can.
Well, because I mean, we don't want the police and the military to decide what we can say and read, and that's what makes our country amazing. Is that our founding fathers, they said, speech comes. It's the First Amendment. It comes before governments. Where it's not in Europe, the king would decide whether you could say things. We didn't want it that way. We said we want to decide.
Here's what it tells me that's chilling. And Ms. Subramania, I'm minded of your presence here as a Canadian. So if they can't do it directly from the FBI, then they get institutions, academic, pseudo-academic institutions involved. If they find that that's going to be blunted because we can go take their funding away because there's U.S. agency funding, then they get the Five Eyes involved. If they can't stop it here in the United States, they can go get the European Union or the other governments to say, we're not, or Canada, to deem this stuff to be threatening. That's what, and the dynamic deepens and deepens. This is a big deal. And here we are, every person on the minority side has talked about Donald Trump. I would think, Ms. Troy and others, that if you're concerned, if you're genuinely concerned about Donald Trump as a threat, what we're talking about today should be all the more threatening to you, because we're talking about setting precedents and diminishing the ability of Americans to express themselves. So, Mr.
Why is it that only Republicans in Congress are willing to say this? You know, obviously I've been accused many times over the years of having switched sides or moved to the right. And I'm listening to this, and it describes in detail how the U.S. security state in the Five Eyes countries, which was the subject of the Snowden reporting, the U.S., the U.K., Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, that's the Five Eyes Alliance, the spying alliance, are working with outside contractors, military contractors, to create systems to explicitly with the goal of controlling speech on the internet. And the only people who care in the slightest about this in the Congress, the only people who are willing to object to it, are conservatives like Congressman Bishop. While every single time this arises, this topic, Democrats don't just ignore it, they affirmatively defend it. And so, yes, I'm I'm a defender of free speech. I'm opposed to the U.S. security state's censorship of the internet in conjunction with large corporations and neoliberal billionaire-funded disinformation agents. How did this become a right-wing principle? How did this become a right-wing cause? Why is Matt Taibbi on the right? Because he's reporting on the efforts of Western military agencies and law enforcement agencies and security state agencies to control speech on the internet. The last time they were there, it was extraordinary to watch as every single Democrat, every last one of them on this committee, including AOC and Dan Goldman and that non-voting delegate who pretends she's a Congresswoman, Stacey Plaskett, every last one of them, Colin Allred, affirmatively defended the right of the CIA and Homeland Security and the FBI to determine what content shouldn't be on the internet. This is what left liberals do in the Congress. I'm going to show you one more exchange here. This is with Dan Goldman. This wasn't on the censorship issue itself, but it was on the fact that right before the 2020 election, the CIA created a outright lie, which was that the material from the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, a lie that was ratified by the corporate media. We've been over that many times because what Taibbi and Shellenberger are saying is that this new censorship program is designed to manipulate and interfere in the 2024 election that's coming up. It's designed to propagandize the public to make sure they vote how they want, which is, of course, to make sure Donald Trump doesn't get reelected and Joe Biden does. And here's Dan Goldman, I think, in a very kind of futile and pathetic way, even trying to engage Michael Shellenberger on the question of whether we really know for sure whether the Hunter Biden laptop, all this time later, when everyone, even the newspapers that he agrees with, like the New York Times, that is responsible for his election by endorsing him because the Sulzberger family that owns it is friends with his billionaire family, of which he's an heir. Even the New York Times acknowledges that the Hunter Biden laptop is completely authentic, not Russian disinformation. And yet here's Dan Goldman not ready to acknowledge that. In fact, fighting tooth and nail to cling to this conspiracy theory that somehow it was manufactured or fraudulent.
Talked about the Hunter Biden laptop and how the FBI knew it existed. You are aware, of course, that the laptop, so to speak, that was published in the New York Post was actually a hard drive that the New York Post admitted here was not authenticated as real. It was not the laptop the FBI had. You're aware of that, right?
It was the same contents.
How do you know?
Because it's the same. I mean,
you would have to authenticate it to know it was the same contents. You have no idea. You know hard drives can be manipulated.
Are you suggesting the New York Post could participate in a conspiracy to construct the contents of the Hunter Biden laptop?
No, sir. The problem is that hard drives can be manipulated by Rudy Giuliani or Russia.
But what's the evidence that happened?
Well, there is actual evidence of it, but the point is it's not the same thing.
There's no evidence for it, so you're engaging in a conspiracy.
I'm glad you agree with me, Mr. Schellenberger, that transparency is the most important thing. And my last question for you is, do you think it would be transparent if Hunter Biden came to this Congress and testified in a public hearing, and more transparent than if he testified privately?
Literally, I've never thought about that. I have no idea.
You don't know?
Literally never thought about that.
Public testimony more transparent than private testimony?
Are you familiar with the First Amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Congress shall take no action to abridge freedom of speech.
Yeah.
And that's what you just described.
Mr. Schellenberger, is 13% censorship still censorship?
Absolutely.
And the other 87% is what we call the chilling effect that the courts have long recognized that they engaged in. That is the problem.
There's a broad, by the way, part of the operation, Congressman Goldman, part of the operation was to change the terms of service. So you see them constantly trying to change the terms of service. You see them, it was 35% of the URLs that were, this according to EIP, were labeled.
So there it is. I mean, it was mostly the Democrats on the hearing decided to ignore this reporting in order to talk to Mike Pence's aide to talk about all the ways Donald Trump is dangerous. And that is their posture. They defend it, they ignore it. And I think it is amazing that we have two court hearings now preliminarily finding that the Biden administration engaged in this mass constitutional violation. And of course, the people who care so much about American democracy have no interest at all in talking about it. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.